Mr. Thomas Jockin, how are you today, sir? You doing all right?
Doing good. Hope you had a good jury duty.
I tell you what, and Mr. Jockin, I have to say, so I will say before handing it to you, I would have, in appreciation of you on this episode 100, I don't think I would have
Yeah.
ever thought to connect, say, Lacan with Aristotle, such as you brought to the attention way back when on our first OG Rose episode 10, and how that has been just an endless, really an endless source of thinking. I think also I've always appreciated your emphasis on beauty, which I do think is incredibly important, and how that also opens ways of thinking that otherwise would not be possible. So I've always appreciated that, and I cannot imagine life without you and and just you as a person. So thank you for everything you've done, Thomas Jockin.
Wow, I feel so loved. That's very sweet. Very sweet for you to say that, Daniel. And Michelle too. Glad to have you on the call. Actually, that's isn't it interesting to meditate on this point? Because so let's pause back because it is episode one. I mean, I don't know if you want to call it episode, but it is the 100th net session. I mean, kind of a crazy idea to think about that this is going on for 100 weeks.
I tell you.
It's crazy. I just said it because I know I was actually on Parallax. You had an interview with Alex and another individual there, and the net was brought up, and in fact, the kind of meta discussion of the net there. So I think might be very. I was meditating about that very recently because it's funny because basically we think that structure, any kind of structure, is totalitarian when it's imposed onto us, right? Mm. But then we need some kind of bounding structure, proximity or something to bound friendships or bound relationships with. So I've talked to you privately about this before, Daniel, is that, ironically, the net and in kind of structures like the net or kind of operating, you brought up a lot of skill, basically as a distinguishment of access, basically, as well as just repetitional time. So the figure of time, like the fact that, actually, I was talking to a friend of mine recently about this. The idea of, when everything has to be has to be opaque, like transparently planned, versus it just happens. Isn't it funny how that works? A lot of times in social relationships, it just happened, or it has to be under some pretense that's not the actual reason why you're there. And in fact, when you say it out loud why you're together, it's kind of weird, or it kind of just like throws the vibe off. I just think I meditated about that because if we sat here and said, "Oh, the purpose of the net is to be friends," that's weird. But versus it's just a secondary effect of we're a bunch of nerds who all like philosophy in different dimensions, right? And we all just kind of jump on a screen together once a week because we don't have these opportunities, and we get enough utility value of doing that. But they say there's also a secondary hidden reason that the boundedness of time by repetition gives us secondarily, but not made explicit. I find that very interesting because that's the point, is that the friendship qualities are not the initial intent, but are the secondary consequences of the structure that you built up. So I just want to, nice, Javier is coming in with, no, I just want friends. Okay, but yeah. Friends who like talk about nerdy shit, like who like talk about the philosophy stuff. Like that's the point. It's that we don't just jump on to say like whatever in a pure friendship, like with the boys getting a beer, getting a drink, and just talking. It's a little different here. All right, that's all I got. I'll throw it back to you, Daniel.
No, that's, it's delightful. So, Cheeton, good to see you. Javier, it's good to see you. I think very often, I definitely think there's something about the human being that, and thank you for listening to that Parallax conversation. When I was growing up, there was this diner in Rustburg, and it was called the Big T. And maybe, every morning, all the older gentlemen would be gathered there. And Mr. Chapman, Mr. Dillard, Mr. Frey. And you always knew if you walked in, you would see these individuals. And how there was something that made Rustburg feel like a community because of those kind of happenstance encounters, that no one was necessarily structuring and forcing. And yet, because you just knew that you would see these people, there was something about that was very, very important. And I think that the ability to have those kind of happenstance encounters that are beyond, say, the work happenstance, like the water cooler, different things, are actually quite important to the human soul, if you will, that the human being, to have these kind of senses of seeing those different people. Because I think definitely one of the things that can overwhelm the adult is having to logistically coordinate so much. Like when you're a child, you don't realize, oh, wait, dinners don't just happen. Oh, wait, the chances of seeing people is really hard. Oh, wait, mom and dad have to somehow figure out how to drive me over to that birthday party. And then as you get older, Michelle and I talk about this all the time. One of the problems with college or college campus is that it's hyper real in the sense that it's like this logistical miracle. All these people just happen to be around you in similar places, and you just happen to see people without much of a cognitive load. And I'll give it to Mr. Stanley of having to coordinate a lot of different things. And then as you get older, you're like, oh, crap, these things have to be additionally coordinated. And actually, it's one of the reasons why I think there's a lot of doom, like we're all going to die in the world. Clayton, good to see you. But one of the things I actually am quite bullish about is how Zoom and these online communities, Voicecraft, Other Life Philosophy Portal, allows the possibility of those serendipitous encounters and interactions, like you could see at a Big T, that is not logistically overwhelming. Right, like you can fit it in without having to get all the kids in the car and drive somewhere and give them goldfish snacks. You have this ability of connecting, and a kind of specialized connection as well with people who are the philosophy nerds. Right, we're all philosophy nerds, and we can just logistically like target and find one another in a special way. And I do wonder, to last week's conversation that Chetan brought up, on the idea of the difference between the neurotic or the psychotic, or the like Cadell had that article on the homeostasis versus the sithome, I believe, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. If this is an example of belonging based on the sithome, and if so, what would it mean like to think about this more? But let me give it to Matthew. Mr. Stanley, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you have been doing well.
Hey, things have been a little crazy. I'm actually leaving to go to the Other Life meetup, the Justin Murphy community in Wyoming, that's going to be starting tomorrow. I wanted to piggyback on this though, because I was bemoaning to my wife last night just how like I don't have any IRL friends anymore. All my friends are people who are friends I used to be IRL friends with, who now don't live near me. And I've reached the point where I'm just unwilling to accept what it takes to have IRL friends in our current society. And I think that that's a bad thing. Like, I fundamentally believe that that is a suboptimal and unvirtuous state of affairs, but I can't deal with the coordination and like scheduling a month out, and I have to drive 20 to 30 minutes, and or you have to spend money to like buy stuff, or it's just it's too much. It's too exhausting. I honestly, I don't know how to deal with it. And so I've kind of, even though I'm a very social person, I've reached a point where pretty much all my relationships are online. So I'm curious to get other people's take on that and their experience, but it's more just like the structure of how it works. I'm just over it, and I'm unwilling to do it, but I realize that there's an unvirtuousness there that I need to work on. So
I think it's an outstanding question. I think the coordination in real life, and I definitely think, especially with inflation high, work hours through the top, your boss always has you on the phone and different things, that there were certain legit, and also the fact that you're probably living in a suburbia where you can't just walk outside, right? Like I think it's quite fair to say, most of the time you could walk outside and interact with neighbors or see people, but like even if you live in a suburbia, the people next to you are like just getting home from work, they're exhausted, maybe they don't know how to connect with you, and you go over and feel awkward because they're busy, and you're like, I don't want to bother you. And then if you do, there's also the idea of there's always the issue. I think this interesting question, and I'd be curious what people say about it. There's something that seems like it's not right to just say online relationships don't count. That seems really problematic. But it also seems problematic to run from real life interaction, right? Because there's something about the real life interaction that has you in a place where you could just get encountered in people's, say, mess or drama or issues that running from actually hurts the soul. Like when you're talking about this kind of vice principle, I think there's a part of that, like avoiding real people makes it easier to avoid the difficulty that if you never face, it's hard to become a full human being, right? At the same time, there also seems to be something incredibly virtuous about spaces where I'd never know you, Matthew Stanley, if it wasn't for Other Life, or I wouldn't know Thomas Jockin. I wouldn't know any of you people without the internet. And the horror of that is that you wouldn't even know that you didn't know all of you, right? So there'd be a lack of something that would be more like a privation, more of a bad thing, really, because you wouldn't know people. And I feel like spaces like this actually allow you to have tools by which to deal with real life situations. But let me pass it to Javier and Michelle, because there seems to be a vice, but then there also seems to be an opportunity afforded by this. Well, you can look at Zoom like a coordination problem, like it coordinates the possibility of interacting with people who you otherwise would never interact with, that allow certain development of the subject that otherwise wouldn't be possible. But there's something that has to be thought there, and like you say, it's just exhausting to coordinate real life, and you have to drive 20 minutes, and gas is expensive, and all these other things like that. So it becomes very, very difficult. But let me pass it.
I like Matthew's point on there's something wrong with not having real life friends about, the virtual world and so on. I was like, but like you said, Daniel, it's a coordination problem, right? Like having in real life friends is actually really suboptimal right now because it takes time. You have to coordinate a lot of things. Sometimes, just life just happens. And it seems like having a virtual space is to kind of like mitigate that problem. But I think what ended up happening too now is that, scale, right? Scale happened. People moved. And now, because we have the virtual space, you could say we're almost more content to be there versus like, let's go back to trying to meet up and seeing each other. I think that's one side of the issue. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm hesitant on both ends, mainly because one, I could see capitalism taking advantage of both sides of these questions, because I could see an advertisement where it's like, let's cultivate a space where you have real life friends, and this will be an optimal experience now for you to have real life friends, right? Like this, I could totally see this happening in the future. I really could. Just because it would be something different now, right? Instead of having virtual friends. But yeah, that's my main hesitancy about this, right? Where it's like virtual space makes having real life friends suboptimal. But having real life friends makes the experience actually optimal, versus you could say the virtual friends is suboptimal in the sense that you don't get to see them in person because it's, you don't get to like actually experience their whole bodily presence, right? So I definitely see both sides, and I can definitely see how both sides could be taken advantage of in certain ways. Just because it would just be attractive. Like all you got to do is just be like, look, man, real life friends are better. Like you have optimal experience, right? A friend that's there, right? Friend that's present. But then you have the other side where it's like the virtual, you have the friend that's always there, right? You can always reach them. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, it's a lovely comment. I'll give it to Michelle and Mr. Wen. Well, there's a few things. Like, I think it is important to note that most boomers, not to use the derogatory term, but older generations don't actually seem to have a lot of friends. Like most people don't have friends. And there is a question of if actually our generation or the younger generation has more friend associations thanks to the internet than actually the older generation because of the changing capital landscape or the work landscape or different things, right? Like I think there's a book called Lost Connections that really is based on the older generation to say that most people at most have one person that they would call a friend, right? So there's this thing where it's almost like there's real life relationships that it's almost like you go back to your grandparents maybe they had more social capital versus our parents. And maybe this is kind of a response to that problem that you're trying to deal with the economic landscape. So that could be one part of it. So, Mr. Luber, good to see you. We're having a bit of a meta conversation on episode 100 of the net about like online spaces and if this provides belonging of the Sith home versus the neurotic, as came up last time. So we were talking on that. And the other thing I wonder is if, and then I'll give it to Michelle, Mr. Wynn, and then Chetan, if actually the internet allows the ability of people under global pluralism to interact, to gradually get used to difference, that if they didn't have the gradual interaction of the online space, they'd immediately go to conflict. Like we've talked before, like at Philosophy Portal, on the need for a gradual unveiling in, say, Dante, or you get reduced to ash. Likewise, there's something about human beings that if you introduce them too quickly to something too different, they're existentially overwhelmed. And I wonder if a way to think about online spaces, and I definitely think there are massive differences between, say, Instagram, Twitter, and Zoom. Zoom seems to be, maybe it's just my bias because I hate cell phones, but not that cell phones are all bad, but there's something about this that seems closest to real life interaction versus the text message, although I don't mean to say there's no role. If this actually fills the need for a gradual interaction with otherness and difference that otherwise would be too overwhelming and you couldn't handle it. And maybe this also allows a gradual learning and processing of philosophical discussion that allows you to develop skills that you otherwise simply wouldn't have time or ability to do, because after 4 years of college you're out, and what are the chances of you taking a philosophy extra curricular activity? So what if there's something about the Zoom online spaces that is the development of skills needed for belonging in the midst of pluralism and difference that otherwise we simply couldn't do? So maybe there's a training kind of function of it that is needed for this moment in history, given global pluralism, where it's not, and then it could be used that way to train for diversity versus simply escape diversity or escape the real world. Those are thoughts where you could have, like Mr. Stanley was saying, about a supplementary role. And definitely, you know, Mr. Jockin and I, for example, have met, Michelle has met in real life because of these online spaces. So they allow in real life interactions that otherwise would not be possible, which is very important. And I do think that has a role. And I wonder if there's a certain warming up to people indifference that otherwise there was not the infrastructure in place to do. And maybe that's a way to think about it. And then that would just tie to the question, like an overarching question I have after listening to Zach Stein talk about education. He talks about education needing to train us to identify value, like the eye of value he talks about. He means it in that kind of beauty, classical sense. Does this kind of meetup train you in the ability to value? Are there things because of these spaces you feel like you can value, or values you can see that otherwise perhaps you could not value as well or as easily? If so, that may suggest another function of significance. But let me give it to Michelle, Mr. Wynn, and then Chetan. Michelle, please.
Yeah, this is a great topic. Happy to see you all. Our youngest is asking me a question. What's that, baby? Oh, the wooden banana. I'm not sure, but I can find it in a second. Where's the wooden banana? Yeah, I think this is a fantastic topic and actually like super relevant. I will have to. Okay, here you go. Yeah, super relevant because I recently saw a friend and like an in real life friend, IRL, and I will after I talk. Okay, baby. All right. Like, I really need this one banana for my dog. He has a really cool pet dog, stuffed animal, and he has a birthday party for his dog almost every day. And it's a yellow themed birthday party. And so we have to have the wooden banana because it just wouldn't be the same. So anyways, I saw this friend from in real life, and I don't know why it got me so existential, like to see this friend again, because it had been a while. And then I was like, why has it been a while? Like, why haven't I seen this friend in a while? And there's factors like they had moved a little bit away, and I just, just life, like just trying to get, do homeschooling, do the dishes, like you know, like this, there's already a lot that already has to kind of be attended to. So it's like if I guess there was a sort of weird feeling of like it almost felt like it had been 100 years since I'd seen her, and it's like what, why this feels so strange. And I then I started to get like sort of I don't know if it was convicted, but I was like, am I just having like in real life friendships that are just based off of like convenience, like, or when I'm really needy, or like needy in the sense of like feeling that desperation for a friend, you know, feeling a desperation for another mom to make dinner with, you know, like just stuff like that, you know. And I guess I was just like, is that like is that really friendship then, or is that just because like there's another orbiting principle that was happening of like if say the kids have soccer, I'm just going to use a general example, but you know, you see certain moms or people at the soccer things that you do, right? And you might get closer with them than the people you used to have repetition with. And so on top of the fact that I feel as though when I'm talking with people in real life friends, I'm not talking with them as much for so I guess what that means is I don't know. In some ways, it feels like there's a kind of a buffer that philosophy begins because it's like we can talk more at length about stuff and we can kind of talk about possibilities and maybe the underlying things, whereas like the in real life friendships are a lot more about like it almost feels like I'm if I'm talking about stuff, I'm saying my opinion, and I feel like more. It's strange. I feel almost more like there's a strange sort of vulnerability, but that can be good, right? Like it can be good to learn how to just speak, and maybe somebody interpreted what you said the wrong way, and then you know, I guess what I'm saying is I find sometimes afterwards I'm like, oh, did they interpret it this way, blah blah blah. Whereas in a philosophical thing, I don't always feel that way because it's like we're talking in the we're taking the time to be meta in our language and in what we're talking about. We're talking about talking. We're talking about these things to help us better like engage in reality. But I say to myself, okay, that's, you know, if you're, but the point of the matter is it's like quite different, and it feels like and at the end of the day, like all of the things that feel a certain way, I mean, it's just how it goes in life. Like I don't think just because it feels different means that might be pluralism, even in your very like in your rural town with somebody who has quite a lot of similarities to you. There's still these strange differences that present like level of how much do they engage with things. And I'm still thinking about the stuff that they're probably not thinking about anymore, which is totally fine. They don't need to. I might not even need to be still thinking about it, but I am. I'm thinking about like, oh, what does that mean? And it's not bad. And I'm really like one can just work that out in their own writing or thinking or recordings or whatever. You're gonna have 100 of those? Okay, wonderful. But yeah, I don't know. It was just sort of a weird moment where it's just a realization of how much these orbiting principles seem necessary for adult in real life friendships, but also sort of a conviction of like, am I not being a good friend because sometimes I'm having these out of like logistical conveniences, you know? So that was kind of a lot there. But I was thinking about this as it relates to the wonderful conversation with Alex Ebert and Daniel and Andrew Sweeney at Parallax, where they were talking about repetition, right? And like how I guess what I mean to say is like what's strange though is that if you just have one logistical thing get switched for another thing, like, oh, you changed dance schools, so now you're not seeing that same mom as regularly. That didn't hit like some natural saturation. You just changed, like for whatever reason. And so now it's like there's a question of sort of what the repetitions are, you know, not necessarily happening as much. And so it shows me that like repetition is necessary to have the in real life friendship. But if for some reason you fall out of those repetitions, for some reason I feel more existential about it. Like, why? You know, why is that? And maybe it's just coming down to like a radical kind of to Daniel's point about like absolute choice, where you just choose like, well, you may have made choices for certain reasons, and that's okay. You know, sometimes there are certain seasons where you might find yourself with a closer companion than another. You know, as long as like there's still that openness to be able to interact with them and like learn from them and help one another out, especially if you're proximal, like be able to bring each other meals if you need to or whatever. But anyways, that was a little bit all over the place, but thanks for letting me share. And I think this topic's really great. Yeah.
No, that's delightful. And that's a beautiful example with Reed of a real life encounter. So fantastic. And he does have a birthday for Purple Flower every day. I think there's a lot there. I think, and I'll pass it to Mr. Wynn, Chetan, and Mr. Jockin, and Mr. Luber. I think there is an issue where as you have increased options or different choices of life, it becomes more difficult to have regularity. Therefore, it is more difficult to have encounters. And if you do encounter, to have something encounter to talk about. This is the problem. Like when you have everyone kind of making their own choices, or you have kids and one goes to college at the University of Washington, another in Pennsylvania, another in Florida, they all then have very, very different common life experiences. And then when you try to relate to them, like I can mention to you, Michelle, I can say, yeah, at the Courthouse Cafe, I saw Mr. Frey. And you know exactly what I'm talking about because you've been in Rustburg and you've seen those places. But if I'm talking to someone who lives in Florida and I'm talking about the courthouse, where's that? Why should I care? What does it have? There's a whole lot of background. So there's this kind of splintering of background that creates difficulty of communication and interaction. Good to see you, Mr. Rivera. Thank you, sir. That makes it difficult to interact. But then you feel like it shouldn't be difficult to interact because you're interacting with those people. So then there's a kind of feeling of being set up to fail by increased optionality and possibility. And also, if you go to college in Washington State, meet a bunch of people, and they scatter across the country, then you feel bad to falling out of touch with all of those people. And if you do get in touch with them again, they're living in such a very different common life experience. It's difficult to know on what grounds to interact with them in a manner. So I think those, and then the internet therefore steps in to deal with a social coordination problem that I think follows from all of this. And then maybe it makes sense that philosophy seems to be coming back in certain communities because that allows a shared intelligibility that is more abstract and universal based versus, say, Rustburg, Virginia, country like lived hardware store based, right? So that provides a kind of universal commonality by which to interact that makes sense in a world where everyone's thrown around the world. It's more difficult to have common experiences by which to discuss. And there's also seemingly greater or perhaps greater logistical demands with time, work, inflation, and so on. That would have to be thought on. But let me pass it to Mr. Wynn, Chetan, Thomas, Jockin, and Luber. Mr. Wynn, it's good to see you, and I always appreciate seeing you. And I meant to say, Javier Rivera, there are thoughts and ideas, and your philosophical passion and interests have always been inspiring to me. He's left now, so if you're seeing this, Mr. Rivera, thank you for being you. Thomas Wynn, there are thoughts and ideas about Mr. Heidegger I would have never had without you. You have made very clear that the notion of annihilation in philosophy matters, and that it is a freeing principle that allows liberations that otherwise would not be possible, and that it has a lot to do with our capacity to engage in a formulation according to a new horizon that otherwise could not occur, that feeds well into Mr. Jockin's notions of beauty. So I always appreciate seeing you, and I appreciate you being here, sir.
Very nice words on this tired evening. Thank you very much. Basically, I found this question really interesting because it's actually something I've considered more recently because now, so basically the last 3 weeks I've been very antisocial, but I'm also going to a cafe every single day to do my PhD. So I'm actually overstimulated by a type of in real life stimulation, which in a way has made me question, am I socializing enough, even if I'm thrown into this kind of constant world of saying hi because I'm back in my very small town? So actually, it's a very overstimulating in real life way of being. But then it brings up the question, and I think this is what's really interesting for me is what really is the distinction between in real life and online? What really is the distinction? I think this is because I'm coming to a close of my PhD and I've been working through Zizek a lot, more than I expected. I've rehashed him in a way which is the middle part of my work, but it's always, and even I think it's the punches, always questioning this thing that we call divisions, divisions between terms in a way. And I think this can be applied here. What do we really mean, real life against online? So I've just made some notes. I said it's a problem which is framed in a particular way. It doesn't mean it's a wrong way or a positive way. I think it's just a way that we've experienced it in that kind of even the last 3 weeks for me. I've experienced that question of seeing the emails for the net wanting to get home in time, not getting home in time, because I know that in a way, in my day, in being overstimulated by the community in my town in a very simple way. And sometimes I have really nice conversations with friends and stuff, but then I see an email like the net and I'm like, oh, that's nice. Like, bring me to this space, you know? So even if I'm living the in real life friendships and conversations at different levels, there's always a moment of saying no, because I know that this online space can give me something which is different in a way. And I think this is the point. Like, I've made a point saying, despite the difference in quality, which doesn't mean like good or bad, it's just a different quality. And I've even put like, i.e. the freedom that online friends and communities give, and being able to choose to participate and be with in a fussier way, a choosy way, goes back to what Michelle said, like, and even Matt at the beginning, like he's meeting the group tomorrow, but then it's easier online because you can be like fussier with your time, you don't have to spend as much money, etc. I made an important point. I said this quality is not that between better or worse explicitly, but just in terms of difference as such. Like, it's just different. Like, it has something to it which is different. And I think each particular person in each particular experience of what online means can then judge it. Like, if you're on Instagram scrolling through reels all day, your experience of the online community is very different than coming to the net, especially number 100 as well. It's an honor to be here. And then this is the Heidegger point I wanted to make. It's really a big thing. Like, you can be, I really believe this, like, you can be nearer to a bridge, literally a bridge in another country that you've experienced in any way, online or in real life, than you can be to a person who's in the same room as you, who's physiologically, physically closer to you in the room. And I really believe this. I think you can have that sort of relation with the other, even if you want to say, as like Zizek would say, it's subjectively mediated, it's part of the illusory aspect of thinking. Or as Heidegger would say, actually, no, like the essence of what's gathered to you in your mind is true. There is not like you as the representer of the outside thing, like in the experience of disclosure of the thing, that's it. Like, it's that trans-appropriate, it's the experience. The idea of subject and object falls apart, you know? Oh, just turn my mic up a little bit. But the main point I wanted to make, sorry, is this Heidegger point. Like, both real life and online are both set to be let be, meaning be whatever they come to be. I think because we kind of despise online because it's like technology, it's mediated through the laptop, the computer. And I said, despite whether the online community is mediated through technology, we could even say that real life is still mediated by a type of technique like technology, i.e. language. Like, when this is acknowledged, then the very distinction kind of drops and we encounter a desire to be with those people or communities in a way which then potentially maximizes the possibilities of encounter. And I think that's the question, is like, we don't have to like think of it as negative or positive. We can say, well, at this moment in my life, this seems to be giving me this. I also remember in the past, it was nice to go to this place with this specific person or this group of people, or to be in this specific church, or to be in this specific community hall, or to be in this specific political party and to experience, you know. And then I think, Daniel, your point as well, like online spaces in a way speeds up the differencing, which is important to philosophy, which then undoes those overly conditioned aspects of what was assumed to be the case. And I think that's why technology can be affirmed. And like its negativity, it's sped up difference. Like, it's made us aware of different communities around the world with different perspectives in a very quick way. And I had asked the question, and this is my question to all of you: does the online space give a full sense of speeding up difference, insofar as it is a kind of relative exchange of difference, which, according to the early Heidegger, only touches upon the necessity of anxiety? And this goes to what Michelle said, like going out to meet the friend after a long time, it can be a bit daunting in a way. Does it only just touch upon the necessity of anxiety, which is there to break down what we assume to be different, like the indifference of perspective? I think this is, I don't really agree with Heidegger here, and I think it's the early point, but it's quite a good way to frame the online question. Like, that's my question. Does the online space reduce anxiety in the sense that we don't always have to confront difference in its real life aspect? And that's the question. What is it about the real life encounter? Is it the mysteriousness of it? Is it the fact that it's outside of the algorithm, the outside of the routine, that anything can be said, anything can happen? But I would say this goes back to what I heard, I think it was from your conversation about Alec Ebert, but a different one. I think I watched a net that I wasn't speaking with, and I think it was talking about this idea of repetition. Like, even if you repeat the net like 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, and there seems to be the similarity to it, you know, like the same people more or less turn up, like where does difference approach encounter in this? And I would say like that's the point. Like even if difference is not as quick in this sort of community that we're experiencing now, when it does happen, because of the type of quality, neither good nor bad, it's more like, I think there's more of a radical change, and that's online, and that's the point. I think that's the point. Like the difference kind of falls apart a bit between an online and in real life community. But yeah, that's my point. It's a very nice topic because I haven't really thought too much about it, and now I am. So thank you for the food for thought. Cheers.
Delightful. I appreciate everything that you would. Chetan, please.
Just 1 minute. Vin, is the question that does online always reduce anxiety? Would that be right?
Yeah, like I said, does the online space give a false sense of speeding up difference? Which, if we put it according to Dall-E, Heidegger, only touches upon the necessity of anxiety in order to break down what we assumed to be the indifference of one perspective compared to another. So basically, like, what is, and is that in a sense, we're questioning the difference between online and real life in terms of anxiety, even just like, if you assume that anxiety is that, or even like a beginning abject feeling of difference, like, oh, that's different, that's not known, that's outside of my rationalized way to deal with the world around me. I think, and that's what life is, like that's the real in the psychoanalytical sense. Yeah, like I recognize in my signification of something, it's not just like there's a lack outside of it, but the very word I'm using to describe it has itself a lack, which for Zizek then means that the real is, or being itself is lacking. You know, the real, like that's the point. Like, how is it that we experience people around us or things, and what is, like, so maybe it's just a way of framing the question, like, what does the online space give us in terms of that confrontation with difference, which for the early Heidegger is like the mood of anxiety. Like mood of anxiety is very important. It's very like, it's actually the place that should be affirmed, you know, like being towards death carries with it the feeling of anxiety. And when you wait with that feeling, you move beyond in a kind of Hegelian way, you sublate it because you recognize, oh, what I deemed it to be is a kind of ontological anxiety is just a moment in the movement towards what he would call like disclosure of being, or what I would say Hegel calls like true consciousness. Like it's that moment of negativity where difference starts to appear, and it makes you question what you think is the case, you know. And that's the question: is like, does the online community give you that? Like, does it?
Yeah, Daniel, would you mind if I ask another question?
Please.
You mean that? Yes, you mean that here anxiety is something which has to be affirmed rather than completely spread up around. Would I be right in thinking that way? That's what you coming at? Anxiety is real life encounter to affirm in that sense.
Yeah, or like there's so I think the first question in a way, and this is again like this is my presupposition. I'm realizing like I'm coming in this with with my own ideas quite heavily actually, but like does real, okay, let's make this basic. Does real life give you more anxiety with difference than the online space? Is there something about the online space which kind of builds in like a repetition, you know, algorithm? Does it make you feel comfortable? Is this why people scroll? Is this why people have identities in this kind of fixed way, you know? So then like, are we now, especially post-COVID, like, are we kind of hesitant to go back into that difference of real life purely because there is a difference of anxiety? Like maybe in the end though, I think the online community or online space can make anxiety more fine-tuned actually. Like if you scroll through stuff, I think there's a deeper level of anxiety. I think it's just, you know, yeah, anyway.
One of the things I'll say is that I think it is very difficult to find people that have enough charity to handle difference without blowing up. Like interaction requires a certain civility. Like, so for example, I can say that just talking with other Christians about Christian theology who are supposedly similar can get you in huge trouble or black sheep real quick. Like just because there's a similarity, most people, unfortunately, it is very difficult for them to interact without it turning into them getting angry or them getting offended. And then you're already, you know, to Mr. Stanley's point, you've already driven 20 minutes, spent money to see them, and now they're angry at you. And now you have a lot of pressure on you as you just try to get all the stuff done you can't get done. And you're like, well, maybe next time we won't talk about deep things. So then when you see them, you don't talk about deep things. But then you're like, why are we interacting? Because what is it doing? Because it's not clear that it's virtuous, right? It's not clear that it's actually enabling the subject. And so I think that's part of it, where the logistical demand, it's this weird thing where the logistical demands for real life interactions are higher, and the probability of those real life interactions feeling virtuous is lower. And so then there's a rational emphasis on, say, the online mechanisms that allow you to get the most, dare I say, social bang for your buck, that also doesn't cost as much, and then also feels as if it is contributing to virtue or contributing to depth. Because the other thing I'll say is, like, I would absolutely way prefer to have all of you in person. The problem is I don't know how to coordinate that yet. Every week on Thursdays in the living room for 2 hours before you get back to your job tomorrow. If y'all know how to teleport, let me know. I can tell you from Mr. Luber or Mr. Jockin being here in person, the quality of interaction is extraordinary, because it is not, it is because y'all have that certain itness. Y'all have that certain aura, that certain virtuousness that makes a certain life in the friendship that is very rare. And so, since it is not possible to coordinate this, except maybe if all of y'all have private jets, let's work on that, that then makes it very difficult to have those interactions, right? But if, like, literally everyone could drive 20 minutes and meet up at a diner somewhere, I'm sure all of us would be like, heck yeah, you know, because that is better. But the probability, and then I'll give it to Chiton, the probability of having people of that quality that are able to regularly coordinate at a real life location for whatever amount of time they may have is incredibly low. And so the internet steps in to deal with that coordination problem that otherwise would not be addressable. It would not be addressable. And I think the other issue is that, unfortunately, most of the time, a lot of people in real life, a lot of people talk about their drama, they talk about problems, they gossip, they talk about how they're upset with other people, and you find yourself in a situation where you have to respond to that, and you may not want to respond to that because you feel like you have to participate in the gossip, but now you're kind of in a place where if you don't respond to it, they're angry at you. So there are these, but you don't have to worry about that when you go to meet someone in real life who's like y'all, right? And so those are the other issues. I think so much of it is dealing with a social coordination problem. And I am of great interest of it because if last week we're talking about the possibility of belonging in the Sithome, the belonging in something that is able to have more of this kind of psychotic structure versus a neurotic structure, then the only way to have belonging in global pluralism must involve some sort of coordination mechanism like Zoom makes possible. Simply given the probabilities of the problem. And then, I guess to your point, Mr. Nguyen, if there is something about these interactions that allow you to regularly interact with people who are very different from you, but share in the manners of charity and social interaction where they're able to listen, and therefore train you to say, wow, I can talk to atheists who aren't going to treat me like an idiot. Wow, I can talk to like communists who aren't going to shut me down. It is possible because I've met them and they are able to listen and actually teach me things I otherwise wouldn't have known. The likelihood of encountering someone in real life who radically shares a very different worldview from you, who also has enough social skill or manners and abilities to listen so that it proves able to actually teach you something and you grow from it, is all incredibly low. Because not only do you have to coordinate people together, you have to coordinate that kind of person so that the other who is different from you is in fact one of whom encountering can be someone you learn from. Because if you encounter someone different from you and they just yell at you the whole time or shut down or aren't interested or just gossiping, that would not be an encounter of difference that can actually have you grow and change in light of difference. And so I think like the issue is encountering anxiety in of itself is not a virtue if it does not bring with it the social mechanism so that anxiety is something you can gradually work into, learn to dance with, build off of. And that requires seemingly an entire toolbox of social skills of someone very different from you, of whom the probability of encountering in real life is simply low. And yet, if you don't learn the skills seemingly necessary for global pluralism or for belonging of the Sithome, as we were saying last week. So I think there's this massive social coordination problem. And if that is all true, then somehow integrating this kind of community into school, education, and this infrastructure all becomes, I think, of great importance. Because otherwise it doesn't seem possible to deal with this very hefty social coordination problem necessary for belonging under the Sithome or in global pluralism. But let me give it to Chetan, Mr. Jockin, Mr. Luber. And Chetan, every time you speak, you bring such fire and elevate the quality of the discourse. It is extraordinary. Your dedication to being at the net at 4, 5, 6 in the morning is unbelievable. I am so glad to have met you. We would have never met without the internet or the net. So I'm extremely grateful for that. And I am always amazed with your precision of thought and language and everything you bring. So thank you for being you, Chetan.
I love being here. I love being here. I love yeah. Actually, I wanted to say something, and then Thomas sort of completely threw me off, and now I want to connect both the things. So let's see if I can do that. Internet is actually a strange, in some senses, economy kind of a question where there's a trade-off. Of course, I would love to meet you all in person and do this in person, but the fact is that what I can do in person always gets sort of trumped by what we can do here. And I think the answer to that question is never one way or the other. It should not be that people we are meeting online, we should never be able to meet in person. That is also a limitation. And vice versa, we should not give up on this chance that we have with each other because of this medium, just because at this point we can't meet. So there is this relationship we need to find between these two things, because both have their own value. For instance, I sort of do reading groups at my own house once a week, at least on Lacan, where we meet for 4 or 5 hours straight. So we sit for 4 hours and we talk and we pick up a reading. And when you sit for that long, there's a different kind of relationship that builds from those kinds of equations, which are valuable. And I would love to see if we all sit, say, even once a month, some point in our lives, and and see what conversation would happen. They would, of course, develop a different kind of a texture with time. So how do we think about that kind of, how do we bridge these gaps? It's not about using one or the other, but how do we bring these two worlds in contact with each other? That's a challenge for, I think the times we are moving in. What is interesting about within this is the question of friendship. I remember Hannah Arendt sort of saying that friendship is always something singular. I mean, if you generally have everybody is my friend and nobody is your friend in that, in that sense, there is something very singular about friendship. In that sense, friendship itself includes, at least in one of its dimensions, friendships based on utility, pleasure, we can discuss separately. But friendship, what we mean by friendship, to love somebody else, for that person in that sense. Without this immediate any utility coming from it, any pleasure, seeking for some deeper satisfaction than that, is a great virtue in itself. Aristotle saw that very early on. There's some great virtue in human beings able to love someone else. I think I don't remember Aristotle. It's been long I read him, but that line still resonates with me in that sense. And that love can only be singular. If it's simply general love, then that something general can come out of it. But there is something very singular about that trait. For instance, a lot of people I may read philosophy with, there are a lot of people, but there's some of my friends which are there from my childhood, whom I've never done any philosophy with, whom I've never ever interacted. They might not even know what I read, or I read or not. In that sense, we might meet once in 2-3 years now. But we don't interact that much. We have different lives. But whenever I meet them again, there is something that it gets evoked in that relationship, which is of a different texture. I do have friends whom I do philosophy with also, but as I said, there's something of the nature of symptom already there in friendship. We may reverse that claim in some senses, that if you have a friend, that friend already invokes something similar in you, for that person in that sense. And how do we think about that structure? Because friendship is also interesting, because many people think that because we have blood relationships, we have natural, kins and affinities, friendship sort of comes later after that. Aristotle reversed that criteria and said, if there was no friendship, there could not be any other relationship possible. Friendship is the basis for all other, in some senses, relationships to exist, because we can love someone in that singular, fashion. So friendship is also a great political act in that sense. It's not just, simply just something you do for. And how do we think about that? And quite in between, in my 20s, late 20s, I started thinking that I can't make friends anymore, or at least I can't make friends with people who do not have similar interests to me. And I'm just trying to sort of think of symptom different from the having similar interests. That is what I'm trying to do over here, in that sense. And recently I met somebody who was from a completely different world of mine, and we used to play basketball in the morning. Just go and play. He never read a book. I never told him I read, and once he left, he moved out of the country. I used to miss him. I used to miss our sessions. I used to miss that camaraderie. I play basketball with like many people in my life, but that relationship that I formed with him was something singular, which I cannot repeat with everybody else. How do we understand? It's not just sharing of an activity. There's something more happening through that activity which has to be thought through. Maybe one way to put it is that some kind of identity, some kind of subjectivity is popped up through that activity. That activity becomes the linking point of subjectivity to be coming into being. A subject to exist. It is that. It's replacing the paternal function in some sense, if you may say it like that. And that, I think, connects to what I think Thomas was pointing out. That does this speeding up of difference, the way he's putting up, and maybe we can have a longer discussion on anxiety with, maybe I don't want to get too long, but does this speeding up of difference actually doesn't allow the subjectivity to be formed in some senses? And in what context we can slow this down, this difference, such that a form of identity, a form of subjective experience, not an objective experience, not an experience which is totalized on the side of object, but on the side of the subject, can be realized. And what is it about those experiences? How do we understand texture of those experiences? What is it about? It's not just sharing an activity that would give those to you. As Thomas was rightly saying, if it's just the online thing would probably speed up the difference and it would vanish. But there's something else which online gives us the access to, even with all its problems, that it does help us give us an experience which can be realized on the side of the subject, where a subject can be born and reborn, an action can take place, and so on and so forth. What is it? I'm not sure. Maybe we all can think about it. Yeah.
Excellent. I think that's wonderful. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, Mr. Luber, Michelle Clayton, and then Mr. Wynn. I think what you're saying, because I can think of people like who in the blue collar background, wrestling, different things, that it had nothing to necessarily do with philosophy at all, but there was a certain quality of interaction that was special. That seemingly there is something about philosophy that increases the probability of that being present, but it is also not reducible to philosophy, because there's lots of people that you can talk philosophy with and you're like, well, this is miserable. You don't want to be there. There's a certain kind of philosophical dialogue. Like, I can definitely say that a lot of philosophy or intellectual discussion on a college campus was a bit miserable, right? So it is not merely the topic, but there's something, it's some kind of openness, some sort of receptibility, some sort of like there-ness that feels like scole or rest or intimacy. It feels like I can fall and you'll catch me. Some sort of, but let me get, and it's like sithome. I think that's it. There's friendship and sithome. But Chetan, did you want to say something else, my friend?
Yeah, I'm just saying that in my case, second, a lot of people I enjoy talking philosophy with, but it doesn't translate to any other activity.
Yeah.
Even if I start talking something else, I get bored and I will move on. So even if I enjoy talking philosophy with somebody, it may not become a friendship in that sense. It's only in very few cases where philosophy also translates into becoming a symptom in that sense.
Yeah.
At least in my experience.
No, I think that's very well put. It's some sort, well, it is interesting that, again, if we think about beauty, truth, and goodness, like there's some sort of idea that philosophy is the way to these things, but it's also like just because you talk about philosophy or have a logical syllogism does not mean you're participating in these things. I think for me, I find that philosophy tends to define the quality of a very intimate relationship that certainly is conversation-based, as seemingly these online spaces must be, because there's something about philosophy that allows you to listen in a certain way, to be open to the other person, to talk in a manner that feels valuable or increasing conditioning to experience beauty. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when you say go down to the creek with your friends or people in real life or sit in the diner, that can't be there as well. It feels like some sort of participation with something between you that is a result of a certain openness to the other that also knows how to keep yourself from, say, well, like the problem is a lot of times you'll talk with someone they get upset, and it's like it's almost like the music gets shut down. It's like, you know how you're at a dance party and the music's going, but then like the music gets stopped. It's like, I guess we'll go home now. There's some sort of feeling of music, I guess, some sort of frequency to things that philosophy may have a special capacity to train us into accordance to, but so can just basketball. So can just sitting in a diner or working in a restaurant. I think that point, and whatever that is seemingly necessary to think belonging of the sithome. That ability to be attuned with that frequency or aura or dance seemingly is what is necessary for belonging that is not neurotic based, that is more sithome based. And it seems to have something to do with friendship. So I appreciate that. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
It's been a good conversation. I'm really enjoying it. You know, I think there's a couple of parts here, right? One is obviously, I think it's been pointed out that there's anxiety and tensions both on online spaces and physical space. I mean, the very fact of doom scrolling as a concept is a demonstration of that. So I think Thomas is very fair about some of those points about that. I think that's very fair. I would say probably the big difference is spitballing on kind of in meditating on this point is anything that's virtual like this has a kind of flattening effect. What I mean by that is, like, while there have been some exceptions, I forgot which one of us here, but one of us was going skiing, basically. It was legendary. I forgot who it was. I think it was Philip. Was it Philip? Yes, it was. I knew it. So that was legendary. I mean, I still remember that because of just, let me put it this way. It stood out to me because of how different, radically different, surprising that was, because that's so not the way we would interact on the net. How does it go? We're all sitting in front of computers or cell phones, for example. Like, that's what I'm getting at. Like, there's that kind of flat, first of all, there's this issue about, how best to put this, kind of a hex city flatness, in the sense that when we're dealing with virtual and screens, we have to be in front of the screen and we have to interact with this right now, versus when we meet in person, there's that flattening is removed. In fact, it's probably one of the distinctions of the virtual to the real is that the real actually has this definite excess, to use an argumentation I would use, in the sense that when I met Daniel and Michelle in person, for example, I mean, it's funny that in content, the conversations of philosophy were there, but they're interspersed with playing with the kids, making a meal together, walking around the house, getting a tour, like the interspersing of all these other additional things that were not optimized for the conversation that, quite frankly, would be just a little bizarre to like walk you through my house and through the screen, just a little bizarre. So that difference weren't. So while I totally acknowledge that there's totally anxieties on both digital and physical, the thing about I think the real, basically as an extensional space versus virtual, is that you don't get that flattening of what the virtual gives you, right? Because my point is that when you're doom scrolling, you're self-selecting to go on Twitter and scroll, right? Or Instagram and scroll. And each one of those are also mediated through an algorithm that is pre-selecting for you, flattening out all the information of the content for you to see. And then it causes a negative feedback mechanism, because then you're getting attention, giving attention to things that are giving you anxiety, so they show you more of that, and it spirals from that point. Versus in person, I mean, as Daniel, you brought it up, you know, the whole the whole fact of reality when we deal with people is they can say whatever they want and go wherever direction they want to go. That is anxiety inducing, obviously. And also we have to use more social mores to manage those relationships. The digital space that has been externalized by the algorithm and by what platforms you're self-selecting to go in. When you're going into the post office, there's a certain kind of like requirement to have a social civic norm of how to relate to these people whom you don't know. And you have to like self-generate that script, right, to manage it. I'm not denying there's scripts in physical reality, in physical extensional spaces. There totally are. The difference is you have to self-manage that and self-mediate that through, or there's actually a negative social consequence. You're weird. There's the weird energy picked up from doing that if you don't do that, versus digital spaces, it's managed for you, so you don't have to deal with this. It reminds me of this technology as disabling property. I'm reminded of that a little bit. But I think the kind of big part too I'm picking up here is what Michelle talked about, right? The idea of like kind of the idea of what are your orbits of relationship. I mean, because Shaitan brought it up with Aristotle, friendship. Yeah, there's different. He actually is a little more generous than I think we're doing. We're actually calling out like the most demanding form of friendship. Friendships of virtue. Aristotle had no problem talking about friendships of utility and pleasure. That was friendship. It was just it was imperfect. It was under a very limited domain. It's almost like a weak orbiter, basically. It's almost like a weak, the orbiting is very weak. And it can be easily just broken up by a change of any kind, right? You're no longer living you're no longer nearby proximity, the utility goes away, or you stop doing an activity together, that goes away. Or quite frankly, I mean, here's the thing: gossip and shit talking, people get a lot of pleasure out of that. That's a friendship of pleasure. So that's definitely, I think, an example of that. But I think the part that I want to emphasize, I'm thinking about too, is definitely, I think the idea too is there's a kind of goodwill, devotion, and almost actually the word conspiracy, meaning breathing together. What I mean by that is, Daniel brought it up, like when you're in spaces of commonality. So Christians, for example, if your Christology is off the mark, you just exploded. You actually literally have to have a little conspiracy to know who are your trusted people you can actually speak with. Actually, I think that's really quite important to bring up with this space. I think it's true in extensional real space and digital spaces like this. There is a requirement that when we say goodwill, Aristotle uses that term, friendships require goodwill one to the other, so recognition of that goodwill to each other. I think one aspect of that is a kind of trust. There's enough social capital of trust in the relationship that there's not an immediate interpretation of any conflict or surprise as violent or threatening to the body of the psychological body or the relationship body. That's quite important. So friendships that don't have that, or organizations that don't have that, the minute you say something that's completely surprising or not in alignment to what the norms are, will be interpreted in a negative framework. And thus you get all the kind of explosionary reactions that come from that. And actually even worse is then when it's a hidden conversation. So that's what Michelle brought up, that kind of like, oh, did I say something to upset them? It's like this whole kind of self-reflective neurotic operation, because there's not enough. Because the thing is, even if I actually see that as a really good demonstration of a lack of social goodwill, that maybe we disagree, or maybe something was said that, like, it's like, when my best friends do something stupid, or something that annoys me, I'm either going to tell them if it actually bothers me enough to be an issue, there's enough like bounded trust that we can do that, or I'm not going to care because it's not that relevant. I put it in a larger context, like it doesn't really matter that much. So I'm just mediating about these points. Now you take that to like serious. I remember this from like it's a very boomer-esque attitude about America's civility, in the sense of like having ability to have disagreement with each other. That no matter disagreement of some political or social context, we're all American, so we can all agree to that. So there's a kind of bipartisan agreement or bipartisan commonality, familiarity with each other. That I would first tell you that that's obviously a narrative, right? But I'm going to point out that was really there. That narrative was there, and the idea that you can hold difference together within a political body because of some common argument of nationality, for example. That'd be one point about it, but that's tenuous. I guess what I'm getting at, to kind of spitball this, is kind of like, why do some relationships, either virtual or in person, extensional space, why do they have this quality of friendship and not others? I think definitely that goodwill aspect is definitely required. And then goodwill is a very interesting part, because Aristotle says it has to be something you find beautiful. Something that has a desirable goodwill that you wish to have both in your presence and wish for others to have as well. I think that's really interesting. Now that could be an apparent good or apparent beauty, or it could be an actual good or beauty, for example. I only say that because even like we were playing with when Shaitan was talking about playing basketball, right? For example, I'm immediately thinking about, there's a current, like, you have some people playing basketball because they have a good spirit of basketball, I'd imagine. Like it was a fun game because they have a certain spirit of competition that's super friendly, but still also serious at the same time, versus people and actually a certain skill level too, probably. I'd imagine that's probably an aspect too. Again, very analogous to what we're talking about here. People here have to have a certain goodwill, taking each other seriously while challenging each other, holding the best interest that people have something of value to share, that we have certain skill, that we have a certain co-respect of skill, that we can actually talk with each other in an interesting way, in a useful way, that we wish to be present in, and we wish to participate in and take part in. I just think this I'm drawing out is just a kind of a very particular, and also as Aristotle says, I mean, this is moral virtue. That's what we're talking about here, because that's the point. You can have the intellectual virtues and not have the moral. Like it's totally possible to be very incredibly clever, for example, and very effective, right, in making syllogisms and philosophical arguments. But if you don't have a goodwill and a certain moral deposition or kind of relationship to other people in your group, it's not going to be a real kind of friendship. This is what we're talking about here. Anyway, so the kind of close, it requires the kind of friendship we're meditating on, especially like in digital spaces, is notice just a lack of trust, a lack of goodwill, a lack of, when there is difference, is immediate perceived to be a threat, and it's treated as such. But physical spaces have that too, so that's totally the case. And we use basically either social mores in a physical extensional space to mediate the avoidance of that conflict, or we self-select in digital spaces and externalize the mediation process through algorithms and platforms. So just meditating on these points.
No, I think that's all very well put. And then I'll pass to Mr. Luber, Michelle, Clayton, Thomas Wynn, and then Chetan. I mean, as a note, when you're saying about goodwill, one of the things I find very interesting on this question of real life versus digital, maybe it's just me, I find that people today, maybe more than when I was a kid, are more like in real life, likely if you encounter them in the post office, to talk about politics or to talk about foreign affairs or international relations. But the problem is they're not necessarily philosophical trained. They just want to make sure you're on their team, right? Like they're going to bring up the election was stolen or Russia or something. And the problem is you find yourself having to respond to that. And if you try to say, well, let's go through the big picture, they don't have time. And they're actually already upset at you for not identifying with their position. And so there's this interesting thing where I wonder if, like, one of the reasons why in real life situations also can be more difficult is because in our very digital screen saturated age, there's a higher probability of people bringing up, say, political issue or things like that, but not the space in which to dwell in the issue to develop in it. And as a result, You say, well, let me find spaces where we actually can get into deep things. Like, I have no problem. Like, you're almost like, if in real life, when you interacted with people, it was literally shallow, like 100% no philosophy. It was about playing football or like the diner. Great. The issue is I find more and more in real life interactions are likely to be in this weird middle space where a lot of times they bring in political issues, but not in a manner that actually allows you to kind of flesh them out, but you find yourself having to respond to them. And so then you're like, and you feel like you have to lie to avoid conflict, and you don't want to lie, but you also don't want to not get into that, and eventually you get tired and stop. Because you also had to drive 20 minutes, figure out what to do with the kids, pay money and all this, and you just find yourself pinned down. I think this is also an issue that contributes to the breakdown of social capital. Or tribalism. Like, the whole question here is, how can you have belonging without falling into some sort of like collective neurotic authority structure? And all of this increased probability of people bringing up political issues or theological, they want to know what your Christology is. Okay, well, let me explain my view of Rome. No, do you believe in it or not? Well, I have to go through the book of Rome. No, oh gosh. And then you know, if you go to church or something, you get pinned down perpetually, and that becomes exhausting. It becomes straight up exhausting to deal with this kind of middle zone of talking about political issues or talking about theological issues, but in a kind of figuring out what tribe you're in way. And I just want to avoid it. I don't want to be around it. I think that's part of it as well. That then also contributes to people just getting on the screen and entertaining nonstop. Or looking for, say, philosophical communities online and different things. Yeah, and I mean, there is also very different ways of doing online. Like, there can be online communities that are just like 4chan or Discord. There can be the Zoom conversations like this. There can be Instagram tribes or different things. And then there are different real life conversations. But I think the quality that Chiton is pointing to that kind of unifies them all has something to do with a kind of goodwill, like you were mentioning there, Mr. Jockin, some sort of like goodwill or willing of the good. Because there's something about goodwill that is inseparable from the willing of the good. And when me personally, when you find yourself constantly having to navigate tense social interactions where people want to talk about political issues, but not provide the space to talk about the political issues, you feel like you have to like be deceptive. And so that doesn't feel like goodwill or willing the good. But then if you bring it up, there's a fight, and then everything goes to heck, and you're just trying to survive with children and paying the bills, right? So I do think that the media saturation of the world has, even if they are not online, has colored in a kind of Baudrillard way real life interactions in a manner that makes them more potentially exhausting in the fashion I am describing. And so then that is also a factor of the problem. But let me pass it to Mr. Luber here. Mr. Luber, your work on story is incredibly important. I am so glad to know you. I'm so grateful for your own thinking. You have helped me see the development of story, Heidegger and other thinkers in ways I otherwise would not, and I am very fortunate to know you. So, Mr. Luber, please.
Thank you for the kind words. And Chiton, one day I would love to get personally schooled on Lacan, and then after I get schooled on Lacan, we go to the basketball court, and then I school you on the basketball court. That would be a dream. But yeah, I mean, I have learned so much from the net and just the inspiration. Like, for example, I'm not writing the short anymore because we're in like pre-production phase, but basically the entire short was because of two things: you guys exposing me to Lacan, and Daniel's notion of how to escape the cave by itself. Because the short is essentially literally that. It's how does he escape the cave by himself? So my entire career has been shaped in a certain sense by you guys. So like, I'm in great debt to you all. And like, yeah, like when I met Daniel in person, hit way harder than virtually. Like, I can't emphasize this enough. If you could understand how many books are in his house, you would take a step back and probably stop talking. You would just stop talking altogether, and you'd be like, okay, you just do all the thinking and talking for me. But yeah, I mean, I basically what a lot of things. I love this topic on friendship personally. Right, exactly. Who needs AI when you have OG Rose? Basically, the direction I wanted to take it is basically what Win is saying, how there is no virtual, and I think it's very evident where I am at in Los Angeles. So, for example, I really don't think there's that much of a difference between your Instagram and your real life. You see it in LA. You just see it. Like these influencers are what they are in person. How they present themselves to you is exactly how they present themselves on the internet. Now, of course, you can like peel back that layer and maybe like get more intimate, and you can see that it's, you know, an obfuscation of their real self. But nonetheless, that's like not what is initially presented, and it's more likely than not that you don't actually get the real them in a certain sense. Another way of also looking at this is, I don't know, like if people are familiar with Yiddish at all, but in the Jewish culture, like a lot of people say the word like yenta to describe a type of individual or a type of dimension in which a group of people will participate in, kind of like what Michelle is saying in terms of like what you're orbiting. I see being scrolling on Instagram as literally the same thing as participating in a Yenta type of conversation. And what a Yenta type of conversation is basically complete and utter bullshit that is about other people. And a lot of, for example, my grandmother who recently passed away, a lot of her friends throughout the years were not there at the end. Were not there at the end because a lot of their conversations, they were just being yentas, yapping away. Classic Jewish, in this case, women, just blah, 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 bullshit, bullshit. And I used to sit there by the pool while they would smoke their cigarettes and they would complain about this person and that one. And all these conversations amounted to nothing. When the conversation actually got substance, looking back, is when they would question the motivations of their yenting, or questioning the motivation of why they see a problem in another person. And that immediately takes the conversation out of being a yenta and into something real and substance and something fruitful for them to even as an individual reflect on. So like, now to tie that to the Instagram scrolling, most of the time it's bullshit. You're just scrolling, it's like, oh, this thing and that thing. And then you come across an actual post that actually makes you stop scrolling and you actually think about it. So like for me, it would be, I'm scrolling and then I'll give an example. Oh, Daniel and Michelle posted something and it's a clip of this conversation. Well, that to me isn't just the normal scrolling or the normal post. And like a lot of people haven't cultivated the ears to actually follow those type of accounts where it's harder to scroll. Like I think in my Instagram, like not that I'm like the perfect, I follow the right things on Instagram. That's not what I'm saying. But I think I have a tendency to not scroll because I'm following things with substance. I am the perfect Instagram user. Huzzah. But to me, like I really do not see a distinction between real life and the internet. It's very hard. I feel like the limits of each dimension are presented differently, but then when you actually take a look at it, you actually see that they're exactly the same. It's just an extension of the initial limits. Like it's just like another way of putting it is like medicine. Okay. Nature has a certain process where it gives its own, oh, you eat this plant, you do this thing, and it gives some effect. And then someone's like, okay, there's this effect that is existing already within nature's process. Let me synthesize that. Let me turn that into a medicine that is tenfold stronger, or it does the same effect, but it extends it in some capacity. I'm being crude. So I do find it's just an imitation of limitations that already in existing. And that to me is just, again, gesturing to Heidegger in this always already dimension that we're toward. So I think real friendship is basically based in this towardness to this always already existing dimension. So like for me, like you guys were talking about like wrestling and basketball. Like I have friends that I play basketball and stuff, but I actually don't agree in the sense that, oh, I have no philosophical orientation with some of these people. Actually, when I'm playing 5-on-5 basketball and I'm trying to win, it gets very philosophical very fast. I'm thinking about, and like this is referring to my conversation with Jockin, like this is the best language, like thank you Jockin for giving me this language, is there's a certain arrangement of content that I am trying to associate it to some principle, and we are having actual movement, a certain dialogos of how does this content match this principle insofar as I win. Because if the content doesn't match the principle, then we lose. So I do think there's a certain, like, anytime you talk strategy, it's hard for me to not think about philosophy, though it might not be explicitly philosophy. I think philosophy is an underpinning of strategy itself. So like I get very philosophical, not like thinking about philosophy, but I'm like, I'll tell Shandelman, I'll be like, Alex, fucking shoot the ball. You're wide open. Stop pussyfooting, shoot the ball. That is inherently philosophical in my opinion, because I am making a claim about the content in which our team is positioned in relation to what ought to be. And like, though we don't necessarily need to get into the weeds of it, like it can be like, well, I don't want to shoot. I want them to think that I'm going to shoot so I can pass it to you to shoot because you're a better shooter. See, there's like a discourse that kind of like emerges out of it if you actually want to win, or the discourse is realized immediately. It's like, oh, you're right. I should shoot the ball. I'm wide open. Like he sees how the content relates to the principle. So no matter what, there's either this external philosophical occurring or an internal philosophical recognition occurring. Another thing that I want to talk about is love, because like I just want to make it clear, I'm not attracted. I'm not trying to have sex with all of you guys, okay? What I mean is there's a certain attraction to the positionality that I'm in with my teammates in terms of the finitude of the situation, essentially. So in a certain sense, when I'm playing basketball, we all have our own project. And I'm trying to make this parallel to like literally what I see with like, thank you to Daniel. I wouldn't meet any of you guys without Daniel. Like every one of you seems to have their own project of sorts, you know, like, not to put Jockin on the spot, he has a project on beauty. Daniel has a project of belonging. Like Clayton's apathetic walking stick. That's a project of sorts. Like when you're doing your I can't say the word, doctoral thesis, that is a project inherently, you know? Like even like there's this one conversation that like Michelle was talking about motherhood. I forget who it's with. It's like you're having this conversation because you're both have projects of motherhood. You're like, there's a certain towardness of finitude, and that's what the like philia in a certain sense is all about. So I do think like when I become friends with someone, I am attracted to their project based off of my own project. And I think that's something inescapable. And sometimes I'm so attracted to their project that I want to be, and this is where I get like tricky. This is where like Plato's Phaedrus. I like read that a few months ago. It's very confusing to me when the love of friend becomes the love of a partner. And especially when you read the Phaedrus, because it seems like there's not really a distinction. Please push back on that. That's just I only read it twice, like once in college and then once like a few months ago. So like, I could totally be wrong and be missing something. But like, I do believe that there's a certain attraction that of the project where it's like, I don't want to just admire and be a safeguard, because I do think there's a certain level of when you're friends with someone, you do fall back because your friend is safeguarding your project in a certain sense. It's more than that. I want to actually become your project. There's a certain like unity in wanting to be more than just friends and like the colloquial understanding here. So I do think like there's just an inherent attraction, and that attraction is inherently based on philosophy and is inherently based off of this towardness of death, towardness of finitude. It's relating to a certain set of content that is addressing a certain principle. And that at the end of the day is what friendship is. Like and then I'll pass it off. Like Daniel's project on the belonging, it's like, I love it so much that it's not that, oh, because he has this project, I want to be friends with him. It's like, it's more like, no, I love his thinking and who he is and his way of being. And a byproduct of that way of being just so happens to be this project that gets pushed out. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not saying it's all about the content. It's not like a utilitarian, like, oh, your project's helping me understand my project. It's more about an appreciation and attraction to a mode of being by virtue of a particular set of content that is just a byproduct, a consequence of a mode of being. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I can totally see someone being like, you're using me, you don't actually love me. That's not what I'm saying. I'll pass it off. This has been great. So yeah.
Divine, and I'll pass it to Michelle, Clayton, Thomas, Chetan, and Mr. Jockin. What you just said about the attraction, I basically would say that is getting at the openness we were mentioning with Chetan. It is the possibility of belonging on Sitham, whatever that is, that has something to do with the project of the person that attracts. That can be the basis of a belonging that's not neurotic. So the question is the following. How do you increase the social coordination mechanisms to increase the probability that the average person on planet Earth can encounter that attraction by being coordinated with someone whom has a quote unquote project or essence of which would so attract them? This mechanism does not exist. I am of the opinion that Zoom could be this technology in the same way that pricing has been the coordination mechanism for economic resources and has brought about incredible prosperity without, there's issues, but it has been a mechanism of coordination. So Zoom is seemingly able to increase the probability of a coordination of people of whom could have that experience, thus increasing the amount of belonging that would be possible according to the Sitham per se, or beauty, or friendship, or different things. And I am not paid by Zoom, but if they want to write me a check, I will take it. So that would be fine. That is also why I think it is correct to say we have to be careful to draw this line between digital and real life, where instead they're two sides of the same. This is how I would put it. If we go, oh, there's something in real life that you don't get online, but there's something online you don't go in real life. If you say, well, then let's find the right proportion of online versus digital, that's in the realm of understanding. It's still too one-sided in a Hegelian sense. If we want to move it to the speculative reason or the reason, the question would be, well, how do you spread whatever the thing is you find online to the average person in real life, so when you encounter them at the post office, they have that attraction or openness, so that you have that experience? Well, is there something about Zoom that increases the probability of people receiving training to have a project per se, so that they have that attraction? So then when you encounter people in real life, they are more likely to have the experience you can have in a net, ergo spreading the conditions of belonging. And this is why I think this has something to do with education. Like, you know, basically Zach Stein was talking about value coordination. We need to open the eye of value or increase the probability of people able to recognize value in society. I'm only using that because he was at Parallax. I was listening to him and I like Mr. Stein. Well, like I was saying, unfortunately, when you encounter people in real life now, they're very likely to be political, or it tends to be kind of problematic. It would be yenta. That's such a great phrase I was going to say. There's a lot of yenta. All right, that makes you then go online, right? Well, the only way to deal with that is to increase the probability that the person you encounter in real life is not engaging in yenta, which means that they're able to recognize value and to have a project, thus creating that quality. And then the online becomes a revelation of a quality needed in real life. Real life becomes a revelation of online, and you have a social coordination mechanism, a value coordination mechanism. Without this, belonging according to the Sith film does not seem possible, because it will not be possible to have on average, well, I mean, belonging of the Sith on average versus an isolated pocket, it will not be probable that the average person would be someone whom you encounter and can have that attraction. And what you're saying there, Mr. Luber, on attraction to a project, like you don't, it's like beauty. Like that's why beauty is so useful here, as Mr. Jockin emphasizes, because you can't use beauty and yet you're attracted to it. That's what the project does. Because the project, as you're describing, is not something you're paid for. It's something that is some sort of testament to your soul, dare I say. And so you're attracted to the project because you're attracted to the soul that makes that project possible, that is inseparable from the existence of that project. So they all get fed together, right? And so can you increase the probability of the average person being someone of whom encountering in real life or online that would have that quality of experience, thus bringing about this belonging of the Sith film? And I was about to pass it to Michelle, but I heard someone outside stop. So let me pass it to Clayton, and then I'll bring it back to you, Michelle. Okay, great. So let me pass, because I can hear outside. So Clayton, I'll pass to you. Clayton, your ability to just say the perfect image and perfect metaphor at the perfect time to unlock new thoughts that otherwise would not occur is absolutely extraordinary. I'm so glad that you commented on that integral stage video, and that we have been able to interact, and that you are here. You are also a trooper to be getting up at 5 in the morning. And like the apathetic walking stick I use all the time. And it is very, very rare to find someone with that precision of image to bring it to the forefront. So I appreciate that. Clayton, it's good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for your kind words. Yeah, net 100. Yay, we made it. To the next 100 nets. Wow, it's a very fiery conversation. it's on fire. Like there's a lot of notes I'm taking, and I'm not a note taker. So that shows how much fire is here. It kind of feels like we're doing what Mr. Luber was talking about, the yenta, but in a different way. Where I come from, we call it Rugambo. It's Ame Munyoro. So that's our version of it. It's like when you're just dynamically exploring and looking for something to hold on and then do a deep dive. It's kind of like what do you call it? Like a divergent exploration before you can now converge on something. That kind of thing. So yeah, anyways, a lot of things I would like to comment on. Hopefully I don't take too long. So one of the things that came up was, at least what I was picking up from all of you, I can't specifically give specific credit because like we all built in it. But there's this theme about, at least how I'm hearing it, there's like a need for like a freedom for creative expression. And when the freedom I'm talking about is the intrinsic motivation, kind of like the intrinsic motivation for creative exploration or expression, for creative expression of one's spirit. Because what happens is, and I was talking to a friend yesterday about this, like we all have that truth sense of capturing what is true in you'd say a participatory experience, right? Like, you know, the physical situation that we've been talking about, like the in real life. We all have a way of maneuvering that, and we're using this truth sense that is sort of like resonating with the truth as we see it, or we experience it, as we feel for it. We're like, kind of like feeling for the truth around and working with that. But at the same time, we, you know, capture truth, like playing on Vaveki's ways of knowing. There is the there's the perspectival truth that we're always, oh sorry, no, not perspectival, propositional truth that we're always extracting from all the propositions being thrown at us, right? And so if, let's say, you make a proposition to me, Daniel, about, sorry for lack of a good example, the pink Energizer bunny, right? Sorry to bring that back. But yeah, so you make a proposition to me, like I have to take it on trust, right? It's like, I know Daniel, I've known him for a bit now, and if he's saying, he's making this proposition, I will take it on basis of that relation, right? However, if, let's say, we continue talking and then I meet you in real life, and then you do something that is contrary to the propositional, say, narrative you made before, then it throws off, what is the word? The verisimilitude, the thing they use in video games that makes you stay in them because you think it's very real. So it throws that off, because now I have a dissonance between, like, oh, wait. In my experience of Daniel, because I acknowledged the initial proposition you made through narrative, based off, you know, our relation, so I accepted that as true. But then you've done something in real life that is contrary to that. Now I have a dissonance in my, let's say, how can I say, what is the word? Like, I have a dissonance in my interpretation of the spirit of Daniel, because there's a dissonance there. It's like there's two truths that don't go together. And so now I have to resolve that. So as I try to resolve that, before, let's say, you've gained like philosophical understanding and have a broad way of having like a flexible perspective, like before you learn how to shift your perspective and put it in a place where things can make sense, you would go to war for this, which I think is what we're running into, like, in real life, because you kind of go like, no, Daniel, you can't do that. Like, it's not true. Like, I have to fight for what is true right now. However, they're both true. in Daniel's timeline and existence, these are both true things. Now, I have to accept both. It's not a dissonance. It is all true from Daniel's expression. So now I have to reconcile this, and it's very difficult to reconcile the dissonance without throwing out Daniel. So I have to reconcile the difference so I can keep Daniel on the inside. So one thing that I was saying that I've learned how to do is now, if let's to kind of like know what is the truth I should uphold. So I would then go back to, okay, so you made a proposition to me about, you know, the pink Energizer bunny, and now you have participated in a way that is contrary to that proposition. Therefore, this participatory truth that I'm getting now is probably holds a higher quality over the propositional narrative you propose to me, right? So maybe I need to take this and update my model of you and go like, okay, I update Daniel. He doesn't, like, the thing he really said before, I think he meant this, what he's acted out. So I'm going to go with this as what he means when he does that, right? And because at first I had to interpret what the the participatory thing is that's related to that proposition that you gave me because I didn't have it. But now that we've participated, then I can go like, oh no, so I misinterpreted that. I thought it was something else because I had to kind of like compensate for what was missing. But now I have the real facts, the real reality. It's very experiential. This is more real, or the really real, than the propositional. So I guess I need to go with this version. And so doing all that gymnastic is a lot of how do I call it? Like a lot of reality shifting, it's kind of like we're trying to, it would be great if we had a malleable reality where you just move it. And I guess this is what the online spaces are allowing us, because, like I can have this conversation with you guys, in right where I'm standing here. I can walk around, I can go to the toilet, I can shift the part of reality that I have control over in this conversation without you having to shift your own, which you don't get in real life, because in real life, it's like there's a lot of slow moving, immovable, or slow to shift, or slow constraints to change that we have to navigate as we maintain the interaction and the relation, and so it becomes really hard. So the anxiety starts to really grow, because it's like, I'm trying to articulate or to navigate a conceptual world at the same time in a physical world that is very hard to just navigate. And so I'm navigating two worlds at the same time, and world building another world conceptually, in perspective, in dialogue. It's a lot of work. So it's like the anxiety response is correct. That is how you should respond in such a situation. I guess we're not awarding the challenge all the gravitas that we should award it, because it is really a big thing. Like being able to kind of like, I see what Michelle does, like, she's looking for the wooden banana and listening to the net and, keeping an eye on the meal cooking. I'm like, how does she even do it? I can't do it. Like, I can't even imagine doing 3 of those things. Like, I have tried before, like, because like even right now I have to go help children get ready for school, but I can't do both. I just can't do both. It's just too much. Like if I'm listening, like all my attention is gonna go here, and if they come get me, then sorry, I can't give you guys the same attention. Now I have to put it all up there. But having, like, it's some kind of superpower to have that ability to spread your attention out the way you need to between all these multiple realities, and still maintain some kind of coherence. And that all goes back to, like that whole art of, participation. It's like there's an art to it. Like the friendly participation is a technique. It is a skill, how you decide to show up in the different perspectives, and how you update the models of all these realities at the same time continuously, and resolving the misinterpretations. Like, oh, I interpreted that as negative. I'll take a step back. Maybe it's not negative. Or maybe I just need to shift my perspective on it so I can see it the way in which it is positive, right? And then so I can continue that reality, keep that thread going. And then, yeah, it's like there is a very, like I always say this, like there is a reason in whatever, in the Christian story, there is a reason God chooses the word to create the world. He could have chosen anything, right? And so this whole ontological thing does require a language, and you have to build it as you go, and maintain all these perspectival realities, and do all that differentiation and readjustment and reorganizing and moving around all at once. Everything, everywhere, all at once. So, sorry, I've spoken too much. I'm going to give it back. Thanks.
No, it's outstanding. I'll give it to Michelle, Wynn, Chetan, Mr. Jockin. Emilio, good to see you. Michelle, and on that point, Clayton, I think on this notion of this movement between the propositional and the participatory as an example, and the way Michelle does it is because she's magical. And she levitates, and you'd see that in real life. Yes, it's true. So well done, Michelle. And actually, when you walk into Mr. Jockin can confirm, if you walk into the same room with her, there's angels singing. They're everywhere, and there's just bright lights. So, yeah, it's true. But I think on that division, that right there, though, on how if there's a break in, say, the propositional, you can fall back on the participatory. And if there's a break in the participatory, you can go on the propositional. That's very difficult without regularity. Regularity allows you to have like a backlog of participatory knowledge. What do you do in a society where it is very difficult to have regularity with people, right? Or the only people you have regularity with are the ones at work? Well, then your friends are the people at work. And that then contributes maybe that could be an authority-based belonging, or more neurotic, because you need the authority of the work that forces everyone together, and you need the economy that forces people with bills to gather together, et cetera, and so forth. But it can work. But the point is, there's something about regularity that allows that, oh, Daniel's saying something crazy. Well, let me think. Well, he usually says something crazy, so this aligns. It's okay. It all goes together. There's nothing wrong here. But that's a multi-dimensional way of thinking that in of itself is kind of philosophical, especially if the participation is based more on memory versus lived logistical experience, right? And that is greatly intensified relative to the pluralism and diversity you are talking about, right? And so if you want to have global pluralism, cis-owned belonging, there's a certain cognitive demand with that I think is important, that has to be integrated into the entire society top down to deal with the social coordination problem, as I am tentatively calling it. But let me give it to Michelle. Michelle, I love you. I love you.
Oh, you guys love you too, babe. Thank you so much. I'm very thankful for you and for everybody here. And your ability to facilitate such incredible spaces is magical. Honestly, like, my ability to multitask might be insanity. Like, it might be schizophrenia. So it can go either way, Sometimes it's a skill, and sometimes it's not. But you're all very kind, and I do my best, But yeah, I was thinking about just how much like these conversations really helped me, because Daniel, you said it so well, where like there's this mixture, like which mixture isn't necessarily bad, right? Like sometimes people can like it depends on what we mean by mixture, like sometimes people have a hard time with that because pluralism is hard, right? And that could be a type of mixture, but there's that kind of like, are we doing, like, there's sort of this strangeness sometimes with like we were talking about in real life, where sometimes the thing that I meant with it being like more conducive for me in philosophical circles is that we can really like hash it out. We can really kind of go to the depths of that and really kind of try our best to sort of exhaust it and do that saturation of Ebert, right? Like we can try to do that. Whereas sometimes in real life, the person's kind of like, depending on who it is in real life, obviously, like when we get the joy of having one of you in our homes, then it's like the best of both worlds, to be honest, if I'm very honest, because it's like in real life, and it's getting to have like the super saturation of certain topics or conversation. So I think sometimes like what really helped, I mean, Thomas Wynn, I really appreciated that idea of like just kind of letting things be like that, like appreciating it for what it is, and not thinking of it having to be like not doing a comparison thing, just letting it be what it is, but also kind of recognizing that this might be a different arena. And so I may not necessarily want to kind of provoke idea stuff here, because I know it's not going to necessarily, maybe, but usually not, will it be able to be exhausted? So I'm still left kind of processing it, where it's not really, that's really not the arena for it, if that makes any sense. And I think that's okay. It's important to learn that. I think philosophy should equip us to know when we should speak and when we shouldn't speak, really, to be honest. So I think it's a helpful thing. And also like just the understanding of like there's a bigger picture, right? There's a bigger picture. So these seasons, or these like, I don't have to like make sure that I explain myself somehow perfectly to the person, because maybe you'll have a chance to see them again and get to sort of talk more about that topic, maybe not, but like leave it there. Like Daniel will say this, and it's very good. in the sense of like, don't worry, everyone's safe, everyone's just playing in the background. But he'll say like, okay, that was kind of, it already happened. So don't try to like live in this sort of, as if you can go back and sort of redo it. Like it's okay, and like accept that. And so I know this seems sort of getting into the nitty gritty of my psychological or like my psychic landscape of the things that I can kind of mull about in my head. But I think that what's so beautiful and so wonderful and so cathartic, it's like balm to my soul, is these conversations, because it always reminds me that I still am equipped to deal with the things that I'm finding myself in mentally or emotionally or whatever it is. And I can revisit it with the tools of the philosophical pursuit itself, if that makes any sense. So it's lovely, because it's like sometimes our where we find ourselves after certain interactions, we sort of maybe feel like stuck there or something like that, or like we have to somehow reach out and like kind of out of this fearful place of like, make sure it's okay, but it's like, well, no, slow down, sit with yourself and sit with those feelings and ask yourself like, why are you feeling that way? So I'm appreciative, because I know it's not just about like helping yourself emotionally, but there is a real value to being able to do some work with yourself and your internal dialogue by having these dialogues. Like it's very helpful. It's a great, like, in my opinion, a wonderful feedback loop, because in having these discussions, it helps me to slow down and realize that, wait a second, maybe the things that I'm sort of assuming are just that, right? They're assumptions, and I'm not really letting myself sit with, why am I feeling that sort of way? And it's great. It's a beautiful, exciting kind of opportunity of like, oh, that's lovely. There's some work there I can do myself. And then maybe get more discerning about, this is the right time for this sort of conversation or not. Anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm very thankful. I'm very thankful for this space and for all of you. And yes, I'm going to now feed children grilled cheese.
No, absolutely, Michelle. No, that's well, that notion, then I'll give it to Mr. Wynn, Cheetah, and Thomas Jockin, and then bring it to a close on our 100th episode. So thank you all. It's a true delight. I think that idea of a kind of psychological training ground, if you will, or a way to talk through things so that when you encounter things in life, you're able to handle them better. I mean, in that regard, if it is the case that there is, because of media, because of whatever, there is a higher probability of real life relationships actually bringing up political topics or anxiety or difference or worries or concerns, then actually online spaces like this may actually increase your probability of handling those real life interactions so that you don't blow up or isolate from them. So again, in that way, I think there's not necessarily an either or. I think it's not about the proportion, it's about that quality of attunement, attraction, openness, the theme, as you were saying, Mr. Luber. The question is, what do we need to do in the society to increase the probability that the average person you run into has that sort of effect? And I think, under global pluralism, let's say the philosophical distinction we've made between plan and prepare. I think you need that. In a world where everyone is similar, you may not need that so much, because the likelihood of you running into people that would bring out that distinction is not so great. So the need for distinctions between beauty and pretty, plan and prepare, because philosophers are often making distinctions, I think that increases significantly the more you are dealing with difference and diversity, which the more and more people in your family or your kids or whatever are moving and living in different parts of the country or the world or interacting with people in the world, the higher the probability you're going to be interacting with diversity and thus need a mental toolkit. And so I think, like you're saying, Michelle, spaces like this can actually help deal with that confusion. But that would mean that the thing philosophy helps with is precisely seeing the project of the other or being open to the other. And therefore, it's the thing that allows that connection that Luber was saying, or that Chetan was getting at. And so it's a kind of toolkit, a kind of skill kit that is increasingly needed, I think, in that sense. And then that also speaks to the kind of thing that a social coordination infrastructure would deal with. But let me pass it to Mr. Wynn. Mr. Wynn, please.
I'm gonna try and read my notes. I've been slowly editing the last 20 minutes on these points, so it's maybe readable. I just made the note saying philosophy, because you said philosophy allows a connection. change the word allow to let. Philosophy lets connection be. And so it then allows for infrastructure or emails to be sent out to bring people together. I think that's what building means in Heidegger's sense, like on from the space where it's not about differences between terms, like real, virtual. It's not about what the content of your experience is, it's about the way that you experience things. Then you can build stuff, because the way that you start to build, the way you interact with building or sending emails, then has a quality of that curiosity to cultivate or to attune, or what Luber said, like to attract in a way, or to be attracted to things. I'm going to try and read what I've said. If it doesn't make sense, I'll improvise. I think I started making these notes like with Thomas Jockin, and then on from there with Luber and stuff. I said, a point on cultivation, or what Daniel has just called attunement, in relation to Luber's point on what can be termed as the question as to the quality of conversation. Like this is, for me, is like, I think this is what Heidegger's really good with. He follows Kant. So basically Kant says like, we have this transcendental horizon, like we experience things according to the way we experience them. And then like what Heidegger does, he says like within history. So when history changes, the way we experience things changes. So what remains the same for Kant are categories, and the content of categories, the color of something, the beauty of something, changes according to the kind of epoch within which you live. This is why Heidegger in a way is like an extension of Kant. Basically what he's saying is like, whatever you come to experience in your own particular life, online, offline, always be particular to you. What remains the same for Heidegger, the last Heidegger, is the quality of that experience, the way in which you experience this. And actually my reading of Hegel is like this. Hegel's not bringing you to some other world of logical conceptions. He's showing you that there's different types of consciousness, different ways of experiencing the same thing in a way. And I think what absolute consciousness is for Hegel is just a different experience of what always was the case, of what always has been there. And what we find today is this virtual world, you know. And I think the question is then is not to say like, is this negative? Is this positive? Which one is true? Which one is false? Is this authentic? Is this inauthentic in itself? It's about the way in which we relate to the experience of those things which appear before us. Technology, laptops, people, cafes, you know. So I said, rather than the difference between, so the real of the online space, which seems to be a semblance of the word. Again, like I'm framed by Zizek because I'm writing on him. So like, because like and Japanchit speaks about this, Alain Badiou, like the passion of the real is in like the reality of life outside of signification, or the reality of semblance, like ideas and configurations and concepts. And each of these three thinkers, Badiou, Japanchit, and Zizek, tried to show that the very distinction between reality on the outside and ideas on the inside breaks down. And you have to pass through to notions first to realize that even the difference between your notion of the outside and inside breaks down, and it's still cognitive, it's still notional. And I think this is what we should do with the virtual space. We should see that what we call virtual and real needs to be seen as like, in both instances, you're experiencing it through language, through the virtual in a way. And I think basically, and I'm not going to read my notes because I've realized it's a bit too another day. But my main point is like, where does cultivation happen when you break down the distinction between virtual and real life? And it's not to say there aren't differences, but it's not a quality of like, and this is the point, like this is really quite the nuanced aspect of it. Like there are of course differences. So when like Michelle just spoke about, I even made the note at the end, like for example, like personal experience, like the inevitability of long distance online relationships, which I've had twice in my life. And there's been a breakdown twice in my life because of the virtual, because I realized like there's a limit to how much I can let something be, because I've experienced this person in person. And I think this goes to what Clayton said as well. Like if we then meet somebody in person after meeting them online, we notice a complete ontological difference between experience. But it's like, how can you go from being in person to online with the uncertainty of the future? It's like, oh, okay, like I see a difference in and of itself. But okay, so to go back to your point, And I made a note on how this relates to friendship as well. But I think, for example, like I've met all of you in this world, in this space online. Like when I first spoke to Cadell, and like just involving myself a little bit and letting it be and seeing what happens. And I find myself here today talking with you because I feel like this medium, this Zoom call, is a way in which I can approach things that I would enjoy by myself and with others. But I'm thankful that this technology gives me that space in which I can do that without, in a way, like, and this is your work, Daniel, like you're creating these spaces, but I'm sure for you, you're not doing this because you feel like you should do it. You're doing it because you see this tool as something which enables you to do what you want to do. And I think this goes back to what I think everybody's kind of said tonight, like, and this goes back to Luber's word, like, attraction. We're attracted to friends or attracted to people that can stimulate our conversation in a way where we just find ourselves attracted to it. And it's like, you know, what Andrew said, like, I'm not doing this because I'm using you. I'm doing this because like sometimes it feels like you're using things or people because you enjoy it, but it's not. It's like I find myself attracted to this sort of conversation, but it's also then not to resent real life. And I think this goes back to the original first comment. I think was it Matthew when he said like, oh, like I got this thing tomorrow, but I'm kind of used to the online friends and I'm not sure about this, la la la. And I think the point of like letting stuff be is to say like in any experience, I know that in some way there's always kind of horizons of limitations. Like I'm not with you guys now, so there are aspects of this conversation that perhaps might not, that would be there if we weren't online and in person. But the only way that you can be with that authentically is to let it be. Like let, and this is even a friend got his result back today for his essay. He's doing his master's on Heidegger, on the origin of the work of art. He did well. But I think the guy made a comment, the professor made a comment on his paper saying, you didn't distinguish between, like, he said, like, you made it sound like calculative thinking is negative. And I said to my friend, like, building a laptop through technique and tools and data and stuff that's beyond my imagination because I'm not in that world, like, that in itself is beautiful. It's calculated and it builds things. You know, you creating these emails, sending them out, a Zoom link, you're creating things, you're cultivating things. And the point is like when you let that be, rather than identifying yourself as a calculated entity called subject, that's subject to work, etc. When you let it be, I think we can appropriate the virtual space in a way which we would appropriate drinking a glass of water, where you're at hand with things in an open way, opened, you know. And so I think my friend made a point, like, I think he's going to leave a comment to this professor to say, like, oh, the reason why I didn't approach this is because Thomas said, let things be. Like, you can let calculative thinking be. Like, and this is what Heidegger does. He just says, okay, like, you can let the online space be, even to the point where there's a text where he criticizes a dam in a river. And he's like, look at this dam, look what human beings can do. They can stop the flow of the natural earth, the reality of the real in a way. And then he says, like, oh, actually, if that provides electricity for that neighborhood, that also lets people be in a way where they can have lights. And it's like, oh, actually, there's a click. And it's like, maybe we as human beings can have a virtual space which can degrade us in a way, because you might be obsessed with, what did Jockin say, like the real destructive reeling or whatever. And like you feel like shit. I've done it. I did this like 2 days ago for 5 minutes, and I was like, oh, I feel terrible. I feel really bad. I was like this, like all dog videos and stuff, and I was like, oh, but I feel a lack, you know. Yeah, I think this depends how you approach it. Like, depends how you approach a Zoom call. It depends how you approach anything in life, and that's the point. It's not about the content of what you're looking at or interacting with, meaning how you come to define something, meaning yourself, your friend, your lover, your father, your mother. It's about the way that you let that person be, in a way, you know. I think I can. I made a comment about what Luber said about the basketball game as well. Like I had this scenario of like somebody filming the basketball game, and for somebody who has like a passion of the real, they would say, stop filming it. Like, we need to live in the moment and be away from technology. But I think in both instances, you can enjoy both. You can enjoy the game as an observer or participant, or you can enjoy the video of it after. It just depends on how you are with it. And that's where releasement comes in. Like, just accept like it is how it is, and then cultivate yourself and build things from that point onwards, you know, like yeah. And yeah, I'm not gonna talk about these. Yeah, 20 minutes isn't enough to write something and read from it. I've realized this, but still, yeah, okay, that's fine.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nguyen. I appreciate that very much. And I think I'll pass it to Chiton and Mr. Jockin. And there is a storm coming now, and then I'll bring it to a close. But I've appreciated it. Emilio, good to see you, sir. And I think this notion of different ways of experience, like what would it mean to spread the conditions to which people are attuned to letting things be? And I think there's something to be said about if there's too much of a focus on, we need to get offline. There's almost a kind of like, outsourcing responsibility for your relationships or your interactions with other people, because you're saying there's kind of a big other in a way. It's like, well, it's the online's fault. If we were in real life, then things would be good, as opposed to, I think there's a certain responsibility that is inherent with letting. If you let things be, then there's a certain responsibility you have to take to confront what is then in that letting. And I think it can be easier sometimes to just say, oh, this is good, this is bad, in order to avoid that. So there's something about letting that requires an encountering that then requires subjects of whom can handle that encountering and what comes up to it. Mr. Nguyen.
Can I say one last thing? Like, I think, because this sounds quite passive in a way, like let things be. So I think even when Michelle was like with the kids, and it was like, you can say like, oh, let the kids be, like, just like let them do what they want, you know, and like ignore them. But I think what letting be means in a very nice way is to say like, that point you can choose to engage with what then in a way for you has particular meaning, or like the most meaning. So like for you too, it's like, okay, the kids, you know, like at some point you can then close the Zoom call because you're like, the storm's coming.
Yep.
So you're letting the storm be a storm and saying like, the storm's coming, let's close this, you know, like, and that's the point. It's not just like passive and sitting there like, oh, okay, don't record the game because it's virtual, or, you know, like, it's like, no, like enjoy whatever comes forth. And if there isn't that relation, and it's not even enjoyment, it's like attunement or cultivation, cultivate it. Like if you love basketball and you realize that filming yourself doing basketball helps your technique, do it. Like, you know, if speaking to people on a Zoom call about basketball and someone, do it. Like, this is what makes you, why not? Like, this is the point. Why not, in a way? Like if for example, my last point, if being in a long-term distant relationship like online isn't working, like that's it. Like there's a point where you say like, based upon the future and circumstances in like in the socioeconomic situation at this point of this life, blah, 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 my desires, your desires, like that's it. Like, and that's what letting be means as well. It means to say like, okay, and that's the sadness of it as well, like the joy and the sadness, you know. Like someone might come into this conversation and not find joy, they might find like panic. They might walk away and say, oh, I feel anxious. Like, you know, but that's the risk, like that's the space, and that's letting it be means, okay, I feel this and that's it. Like that's how I should experience it. I'm not should, but yeah.
No, I think that's a good, well, there's something about activity can be passive. You can be engaged in activity precisely to avoid. Like that's, and letting can actually be much more active because you have to let the thing encounter you. And I think what you're saying on the letting goes with a kind of encountering and saturation and different things. But I'll pass it to Chiton and Mr. Jockin before the storm. And if I vanish suddenly, assume that the storm has come. But Chiton, please.
Thanks for the 100 episodes, Daniel, if you vanish. Just, you know, hearing us talk all the kinds of things. Quickly, I'll just maybe sort of build upon what Andrew's brilliant point was. And where I was also trying to think about symptom in that sense, and when I was sort of provoking that that symptom is more connected to the question of practice than theory in that sense. That it's not simply a problem where if we are having certain theoretical, which is what I was trying to sort of say earlier, it's not simply that if I'm discussing basketball with someone, playing basketball with somebody, it's enough. The community of practice, as we call it in some senses, a relationship that, and this is where I think you can differ slightly from Aristotle on friendship also. As for Aristotle, goodwill was a necessary form of friendship in that sense. And one can start thinking around that it's not, goodwill can be an outcome of that process, but essentially when you share a community of practice with someone, when you day in, day out do something with someone in that sense with particular aims, particular strategies, particular ends, and use word project, and you involve yourself, you form friendships as a product of those common practices. Practice can be philosophy as well. That's, I think, the first thing to think of. Symptom is always in sense a question of practice, in which theory can help us make sense of the practice. But practice itself, the word theory practice becomes important here. Itself is a necessary aspect of something to be a symptom. Something just at the level of theory can't be, which is what Lacan was talking in the James Joyce's context of his writing in that sense. So community of practice is something we can start thinking around, which is, as I said, what is it about friendship which actually sort of falls back upon symptom? Because without this practice, without this community formation, I think friendship is not, friendship, you can have utilitarian friendships, even in philosophy, but you can't have this genuine camaraderie in some senses. Second, I'll just quickly talk about Andrew's point on philosophy being already implied in practice. And he's right, it is in some senses. But the question becomes, then, is philosophy necessarily implied in all practices? Are we generalizing philosophy to that degree? Then every basketball player, every person involved in any other practice starts becoming a philosopher. And we might not want to do that in that sense. Or does the encounter of practice and philosophy is a very particular encounter, which has to be engineered in some sense, which has to be brought in relationship with. It's not an internal relationship necessarily. Philosophy can prop up in all practices, but for philosophy to be systematically pursued, you need to somebody has to make that encounter possible. It is not something which is necessarily automatically done. It's not an internal, it's an external relationship in some senses. The question of philosophy will definitely arise, I agree. But it may not be the case that it will automatically become philosophy. All practices automatically lead in that direction. They will stop short somewhere in that sense. And this is where I think I want to come back to the problem of anxiety, which we started from, which Thomas sort of provoked me to think about in the context of symptom. We forget that anxiety is a very interesting problem. Let's say in phobia, and I don't read Lacan as much as I pretend to talk about it, but I probably read a couple of his books, that's all. But in the context of his phobia, it's a very interesting problem that emerges, that in phobia, the subject prefers fear over anxiety, because fear has an object. In that sense, anxiety in Lacan is a very interesting struggle between imaginary and the real. The problem being that the real keeps on propping back up in the imaginary. That is the devouring mother and so on and so forth. You can have bad dreams. Your imaginary is not safe from anxiety, which is why guilt falls on the side of symbolic and anxiety falls on the side of, because anxiety is always dealing with an object which cannot be symbolized, which cannot be brought to language. Which is that lack of a lack in that sense. Anxiety always occurs at the point of, where lack itself is lacking. When the lack produces itself, and this is where the speeding of distance sort of comes of Thomas. And anxiety is a double-edged sword in that sense, that it can bring us to encounter the lack also, and at the same time, anxiety can also be something that completely covers up, it completely helps us get trapped into our imaginary. Which is why, if you notice, of course, where anxiety gets nakedly visible, where it doesn't immediately get produced in fear and other forms of, there it is able to symbolize something fresh for us, which is why encounter with anxiety is very important, that Thomas was saying, because it is there, that lack is there, the differences, in that sense. But where anxiety sort of becomes something else, because anxiety is not an emotion, anxiety is an effect. And when it immediately converts into some other emotion, the difference gets covered up in that sense. So the encounter with difference is always anxiety is okay, because the object goes missing in that sense. And when the object goes missing, your effect doesn't sort of become an emotion. So anxiety in some senses replaces and covers the lack, and anxiety in some senses also becomes a point of encounter with the lack. And how do we think through this problem of speed and anxiety, which is becoming a very political question of our times, which is what Thomas was sort of pointing out to us in the sense of, and it is connected to the problem of virtual, because as I said, anxiety is a problem of the imaginary. and virtual becomes on the side of the imaginary in that sense. That there is something about the imaginary that it keeps on encountering its own lack, its own sort of gap, its own and when it encounters, if the speed of it is too high, what happens is it immediately creates a certain kind of hallucination or certain kind of an alternate object which produces an object whose reality is suspect in some senses to find its anchoring. So you can see that in dreams, you can see that in and how do you keep anxiety anchored not in some emotion in that sense, but in affect? How do you hold anxiety at a level of affect? That becomes a challenge. And speed is always a threat to that problem in some senses. And that's something we all need to start thinking around. That when emotions get produced too fast, emotions are very important. And this is where emotions, feelings can be distinguished in that sense. But when emotions when you reach an emotion too quickly, when you feel something too quickly, there's always a certain kind of question over there, certain kind of doubt over there to what you're feeling that should arise in oneself, because then you're not holding the affect together. In that sense, you're not able to anchor yourself at the level of affect. You can only anchor yourself at the level of feeling, emotion, and you become what you may call sentimental in that sense. Sentimentality becomes the word that gets activated at that level. And this is where it becomes interesting that at what point a practice can ground us in that effect, at a level of that encounter with anxiety. Because theory can't do that. Theory itself, as much as we want to do that, theory itself will always, theory is necessary to make sense of practice. But without practice, theory can become extremely, groundless in terms of anchoring you to affects, which is what psychoanalysis realizes. Which is psychoanalysis is a practice. Lacan keeps on again and again emphasizing that it's a practice. It's not something which can immediately be, sort of brought into brought at the level of philosophy. It can be brought to the level of philosophy probably through that long journey of practice in that sense. But it's a practice. First, you have to yourself go through that process of psychoanalysis to bring something else from it in that sense. And that's the interesting, I think, question that with income we need to start thinking around. That how do you anchor yourself in practices in that sense? And I have friends whose character I very suspect and all of that stuff, because we have been through certain kind of war together. We have been through certain kind of practices together. That friendship gets anchored into those times that we spent, or those things that we've done together, rather than simply in some kind of good character that we both. He thinks I'm good, or I'm thinking he's good. And, yeah.
Outstanding. I really like that. And I'll give it to Mr. Jockin to close us out before the storm takes me out. And I've really enjoyed this. I think what you just said on the notion of practices and the effect, I completely agree. I believe, the Sithome requires a practice. The question is it possible that online digital can actually allow practices and training to keep us in the affect at a rate that we can handle so that it doesn't slip into the emotion per se? Like that's what I wonder. And I think the difficulty of doing that increases with the diversity and difference of the people you are interacting with. Therefore, you need a kind of gradual mediating technology, which Zoom might be. Otherwise, it's too quick. It can't keep you in the affect, and the Sithome collapses, and you can't have a practice. Because I think the letting, as Mr. Nguyen is describing, is actually exactly, it doesn't slip into feelings and emotions too quickly. Exactly right. Whereas actually the problem is that real life is too intense too quickly. Like in real life, encounters are too quick into emotion and too likely to go into negative emotion too quickly if you're dealing with radical diversity, to not make that mistake. Whereas online, you might be able to do it gradually enough to make possible the belonging in the new way we are describing, that is not siloed, that is actually embracing diversity, ergo dealing with some of the political, etc. problems that we're dealing with today. I think it can, and that's why it is important not to demonize the digital, but to become asking what are the practices we can use the digital for that allows not slipping too quickly into the emotional or the feelings when dealing with diversity, so that belonging in the film is possible. And I think these technologies can allow that if used in that practice way, because I think these kind of conversations are practices, even though there's a theory component to it. They're also the practices of getting used to going into conversations where you don't know what the topic's going to be, with people that you don't know who's going to show up and see what occurs. There's a practice in that I think actually is simultaneously conditioning the subject to handle global pluralism or diversity. And then if you can spread this practice, if you will, to define the average person you encounter in real life so that they increase the probability of having the quality of the project to attract and are capable of the letting, I do think this could have economic and political consequence. But alas, I'll give it to Jockin and then I will have to run. I'm so
it's funny to like this letting be conversation and concern being passive. The first thing I thought of was the verb await. Awaiting something is a kind of active state of anticipation. And I think actually that's quite powerful, because the idea really of the beautiful is that you're not direct, like there's a difference between an intention, like there's a kind of active awaiting or acting with the beautiful, in the sense that we're not the one directly causing it, but we're participating with it. And that's very different from my kind of stifling, right? So in all these examples talk about like Michelle working with the kids, or basically any kind of interaction with things, instead of kind of compressing it into an account. Daniel, I'm thinking basically our conversation on partial objects. Basically the disciplining training is basically which account are you going to give to the circumstance or encounter? And a lot of it has a temporal dimension to it. In fact, a lot of models or accounts, unfortunately, what they're built on is it kind of fit the model and then operate based on it. I think one of the fair points of Heidegger's essay about the essence of technology is not necessarily that the dam or the river, like I gave a critique about this exact point, right? Where I wrote an essay about this conversion of the ontology of the river changing by the intervention. That's basically, I think what Heidegger is fairly saying is his concern about the accounts. If everything's standing reserve and just operating on that, you're looking at everything through the lens of an account of standing reserve. That creates a very different experience of existence than another account. But if everything gets collapsed to only be about the scientific technical account of standing reserve, that's what you're going to get, is entire reality based on, well, standing reserve. Which is really interesting, because it gives a nice tension point, because the idea of converting the river to a dam creates an indefinite status for energy. It's holding this energy excess to be used for indefinite purposes, which is exactly what we're talking about with anxiety versus fear, right? This is kind of a motive response to fear, an explicit definite object versus an indefinite object, which again is what we would point to be the lack. I'm sitting on this because I want to point out something, Daniel. I want to challenge you a little bit and close you on this point, as I know you need to run, because you made a comment before. It's not about opposite, not about kind of like you're discussing the proportionality of digital to physical versus a kind of like another operation, a different view of it. I'm only bringing this up because you just said prior in this conversation about the problem right now is that we have this weird middle state in real conversations, where the anxiety of a social mores being so depreciated that people need to know your affiliation. They're in such states of instability in their orientation. They need to verify are you on my team or not? There's basically a threat ally concern, and they can't operate forward until you have that. And one can make an argument we're into this middle state because of what's occurred. So I want to bring this up to you. I just remember that from earlier in this conversation. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
No, I think that's delightful, and I appreciate everyone being here. I would definitely say that what has occurred is the introduction of the technology has created the problem where everyone is then political in this kind of middle way that is problematic. The technology simultaneously also creates the condition of global pluralism encountering one another, which means you have two options. Either you get rid of the technology, isolate into an honest way and have nothing to do with it, or you figure out what is the way to use the technology to go through this middle zone where you are then interacting in a manner of letting versus this odd kind of pathological middle. right now. Since I would not be in favor, you know, Hegel thinks it now, I would not be in favor of removing the technology and going back to a certain isolationist fashion, because then I couldn't have the pleasure of interacting with all of you lovely people. What I would like to see is the intentional use of the technology, like Zoom, say, in the classroom, versus, say, using the technology to just facilitate trivia games, like we've talked about before, where education is about trivia. I would like to see it be conversation-based. I would like to see it oral-based. I would like to see it an exploration of dialogue, which then means you're taking the technology to the sublation versus this trivia structure that is a result of having the technology, but not the right mode for using the technology. That's what I would be the sublation. It's a very fair point that you're bringing up, which to me would get to Mr. Wynn's idea of the use of the technology. Once we say, technology bad, real life good, okay, and what I mean by proportion is, well, as long as we only use the technology for 1 hour a day, then it's going to be good. No, 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 no. It's the relation to the technology of which then works back on the subject to change how they relate to one another. Right? And what we are using this technology for is to figure out how to make the cultivation of that quality that is attractive to one another, that then has a certain letting and a certain sort of interaction of depth that you wouldn't trade for anything. And so for me, going into the technology in the sublation way, and then I'll give it to Chetan, is a matter of very intentional training with the technology for the cultivation of that attraction that Mr. Luber was getting at. Whereas right now, because basically we're using a technology as if it doesn't change us as subjects. Oh, it's just a gadget. Therefore, use it to do school like we've always done it. Let's do it like trivia. Let's use it to do society like we've always done it, as of going, no, no, no. We are, in a Marshall McLuhan way, changed by the technologies present in the society, so we have to then change the society with it. Otherwise, we get this very odd middle zone that makes this pathological structure. And the way I would like to change it with it is to use the technology for the social coordination problem that we are describing, that then allows you to have an efficient coordination of friendship to make possible a kind of belonging again that is not following an authority structure like we were talking about. But let me give it to Chetan. Chetan, please.
Maybe on the point of technology, technology is like a pharmacon, as Taylor says it. It's both a poison and the cure. We should, and you're absolutely right, Daniel, that we should, in some senses, think about using Zoom to create a certain community of practices. How do you ground virtual into practice? It's a great problem to think about. Say the same question arises with writing also. It's not only with, say, communities facing this problem. Earlier, it came with writing letters to people and forming communities from that. Quickly, the point being that one thing you have to be cautious about over here is that while real life is faster in one sense, it's slower in another. The real life is a lot more fiction. So when I encounter you in real life, we might be doing in one thing. We may go out to eat food together. We may discuss something else. Because the feedback loop is so strictly controlled in this environment, we are not doing other things together. The speed increases because of the digitalization of of what we are doing. We aren't doing other things together in that sense. In real life, what happens, other things come in between, and this considerably slow down the speed at which we encounter each other. We may be encountering, and different aspects of the person starts coming out. So more proportional responses emerge, whereas speed increases in digital life because the feedback loops are so tightly constrained, where we are only doing one thing over and over again. Because we're doing one thing over and over again, other things factor out, and the friction is not there anymore. Lack of friction increases speed in that sense, and the practice gets more slippery in those settings. And we have to think about how do we balance these two things in some sense.
No, it's an excellent point, because something I think about a lot is a way you can deal with significant diversity if you have like manual labor tasks that you're doing together, and that becomes the mediating that slows down the emotions from going too quick. So it's almost like we got the worst of both in a sense. Like we have less manual labor by which to interact with greater diversity. So it's more voice-based. It's more of a voice-based society, which then means you need technologies by which to work that in a manner that doesn't have the emotion develop too quickly. But those feedback loops, I think, are exactly right and have to be taken quite seriously. Alas, I must run now. I am grateful for all of you. This would not be possible without you. The net would not exist without you. And all of you always bring so much, and that make this space a space within a space, and that creates a certain cultivation of interaction and friendship and attraction that would not be possible otherwise. To all of you, I say thank you.